Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Okay, this is Alan Butler, Butler on Business. Jason, would you please introduce Chuck Baldwin to our listeners?
Alan, we're joined on the phone now by Chuck Baldwin. He's a syndicated columnist, a radio broadcaster, author, pastor, and he was the 2008 presidential candidate for the Constitutional Party.
Chuck, thank you very much, and welcome to Butler on Business.
Thank you, Alan. Great to be with you.
Now, tell us a little bit about nullification. I don't know that your average everyday listener is familiar with nullification. It's my understanding, didn't that start up as recently as, or as long ago as the Jefferson presidency?
Oh yes, definitely. It is absolutely one of the best checks and balances that the Founding Fathers put into the Constitution in order that the states might be able to maintain freedom from potential usurpation of power from the federal government. Unfortunately, over the last century or so, since the ending of the Civil War, I guess it would seem that most of the states just have not really relied on that too much. And now then, we're beginning to see the signs that states throughout the country are beginning to recognize that that is a valid method of retaining the liberty and independence of their citizenry within the states, and they're starting to pass various state sovereignty legislations throughout the various states, including right here in Montana where I live.
Could you tell the listeners what the process of nullification, first of all, what does it mean, and what is the process of nullification?
Well, it all depends on what the issue might be. Let me give you a practical example for today. Here in the state of Montana, there was a bill introduced in the legislature which did pass both houses and was signed into law by the governor, which basically states that if, in this case, a firearm, it could be any product, is manufactured in the state of Montana, is sold in the state of Montana, is purchased in the state of Montana, it would be therefore exempt from the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and therefore the federal government's guidelines or restrictions, prohibitions, etc., would not apply to that sale and to that purchase. And, of course, the feds are challenging that, and right now it's in the courts. But that's just one example of what the states can do to nullify a federal law that they believe usurps the sovereignty of the state.
Chuck, you insist that freedom, if it really has any chance at all of surviving here in the United States, that people must get their eyes off of Washington, D.C. and really start focusing on their individual states. Can you maybe explain a little bit more about the need to focus this battle for freedom at the state level versus focusing it at the federal level?
I think that's absolutely critical. I'm absolutely convinced that the longer we look at Washington, D.C. for the answers to our problems, the longer we're going to be frustrated. I think the bureaucracy is so massive. I think the unconstitutionality of what Washington, D.C. has been doing over the last several decades is so massive that there is just no one at the federal level, with the exception of Ron Paul. But there's no one else that I see at the federal level who has any intention on changing any of the out-of-control, unconstitutional legislation and edicts, et cetera, that are coming out of Washington. The only way, therefore, to protect the freedoms of the people is going to be at the state level. And that's the beauty of our federalist system, thank God. The founders understood that. And whenever we created this Constitution back in 1787, the states did not lose their sovereignty, their independence. We did not become a national government, for example, at that point, with no rights and liberties of the states retained. Instead, the states maintained, and according to the 10th Amendment, maintained the majority of power and authority. All of the power that was not vested in the federal government specifically was reserved to the states and to the people according to the 10th Amendment. And the purpose for that is to do exactly what's happening now, is for the states to recognize when their citizens' rights are being trampled, when unconstitutional government is emanating from Washington, D.C., it is the state's responsibility and duty to step in and protect their citizens. And that, I think that's what has to happen, or this juggernaut will not be stopped.
You know, there is, if I'm not mistaken, there are a number of states that are colluding together on, and perhaps colluding is a ominous, cooperating with one another on a series of nullifications. And I'm trying to think, I mean, it even gets up there to a little over Vermont is joining in. It's mainly everybody kind of, you're starting at Tennessee or North Carolina all the way out. You skip over, New Mexico, and then you jump up into Montana and a couple states. They're all collaborating right now on some nullification issues. Am I mistaken there?
No, you're exactly right. Well, the first one I mentioned on your show here, the Firearms Freedom Act, is now in the legislature in, I think, over 20 states. The one that comes to mind as you're talking on this show, Alan, is the Gold and Silver Acts that Utah has led the way on. Basically has made gold and tender legal tender again in the state of Utah, which is a tremendous bill that the people of Utah and the legislature of Utah overwhelmingly supported. Now, that also is being introduced in various states around the country. I think at least a dozen or more.
Yeah, I think South Carolina, it's actually cleared. I don't know if the governor has signed it, but I believe that one's already cleared their legislature. We've got a similar bill here in Georgia.
That is correct. And that's just another example. I think by the time other states find out about this, they too will begin to take advantage of this opportunity. It just makes sense. I mean, you fellas watch this every day. Let's see, just to leave you, I'm looking at some of the states, Minnesota, Iowa, Colorado, Georgia, Virginia, Tennessee, South Carolina, Montana, Missouri, Indiana, Idaho, New Hampshire, and Washington State that I'm aware of right now that have introduced those types of bills. When you look at the collapse of the dollar, you look at what's happening through the Federal Reserve System and the way that this economy is absolutely going in the toilet, and most of the experts are not even willing to predict any kind of a turnaround in the near future. And states are beginning to recognize that, hey, there's some things that we can do, and those things that we can do, we need to do, and this is one of them. And I mean, for an example, look at North Dakota. I mean, the most prosperous, fiscally solvent state in the country right now is North Dakota. And one of the things that they've done is, of course, institute a state bank. They've had it for years, and they've exercised their autonomy as a state financially. And boy, that state should serve as a model for the rest of the states.
Yes, I have done a lot of studying on the Bank of North Dakota. Are you well versed enough to tell the listeners briefly about the Bank of North Dakota?
I'm vaguely familiar with it. I have not studied it in detail, probably not as much as you have. I'm familiar with it enough to know that we have some people here in Montana that are looking hard at that particular law that they enacted some time ago. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it goes back quite a few years, does it not?
Yes, it does. And I do have an expert on the state Bank of North Dakota. Old Bill Still is, and we'll get him on sometime.
Yeah, and I have some people here in Montana that would love to talk to him about that, because there are some people here that are very serious about trying to mimic what North Dakota has done.
Chuck, under the principle of nullification, individual states can decide that an unconstitutional law is basically undelegated power without authority and is thus null and void. It's a way to fight federal tyranny, and I don't think a lot of people understand that this is something that has been successfully used throughout history. For instance, going back to the state of Wisconsin, they actually used the principle of nullification to push back against the federal enforcement of fugitive slave laws. So this is something that it has historical precedent and has been used successfully throughout history.
Well, yeah, and nullification can take many forms. Nullification, basically, we're talking about state nullification here in this conversation, but nullification can be used in a variety of ways. When our government was founded, thankfully, it was founded as a tripartite government. There was no one branch of government that had sole power. We have a judiciary, we have an executive, and a legislative. Each one of those has a responsibility to be a check and balance on the other. Now, unfortunately, especially Washington, D.C., they haven't done that a lot lately, but you go back into our history, and I'm thinking of an example when Thomas Jefferson was president, for example, and the Alien and Sedition Act passed, which basically said that you could not criticize the government without breaking the law and you being threatened with arrest. So it was a gross violation of the First Amendment. And so it passed the legislature comfortably, and then it went to the courts, and the court said, yeah, this is constitutional. There's terrible decisions by both the judiciary and the legislative branches. Well, Thomas Jefferson was maybe our greatest defender of individual freedoms and maybe the most brilliant man who wrote and understood of the principles of natural law and federalism, et cetera. And he was president. And he just said, "Well, I'm glad that's what the court said, and that's okay if the legislature wants to pass a law, but I'm the chief executive, and we're just flat not going to execute that law. I don't think it's constitutional." Well, that's nullification. That was, one branch of the federal government nullifying an unconstitutional law from another branch of the federal government. I mean, that's what courts do all the time. When courts think that a legislative decision is unconstitutional, they make a decision to counter or to nullify that. So nullification can take on many forms. It can take on the forms within the government itself, at the federal level, and then, of course, if it goes beyond that, then that's where the states come in. And the states say, well, you guys up in Washington, you three branches, you've collaborated together, and you say, this is what we got to do. But, we're an independent autonomous state. We reserve powers in the 10th Amendment. We don't think it's constitutional. Therefore, we're not going to follow it. That's nullification. It's the greatest preservation of freedom that's available to us in a nonviolent form.
Chuck, in the minute and a half we have left, how do our listeners begin to put pressure on since I think everybody's given up on Washington, D.C., how can we as state citizens come together to begin putting pressure on our state legislatures to start doing something along the lines of nullification?
Right. Put pressure on their state legislators and the candidates that are running for public office. Get people that are like-minded to run and then support them financially and otherwise. I think that's the key. If we can put in some governors, some state legislators, some sheriffs, some people, some officers at the state level who really understand the Constitution and their rights under the Constitution as a state officer, I tell you, so much of this stuff can be reversed.
Well, Mr. Baldwin, we certainly appreciate your time today and providing us this excellent perspective on the principle of nullification and explaining how we need to refocus our efforts from Washington back to the state level. It's certainly important. And again, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much for letting me come on your show.